My judgment is that they constituted an appalling episode of serious, gratuitous violence on civilians, which resulted in the death of one man and injuries to others.
A report says UK soldiers used unjustified violence in the death of an Iraqi civilian, but clears the army of systemic abuse. Was this a tip of the iceberg, a PR stunt, or a serious attempt to uncover the truth and learn valuable lessons for the future? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Fuliba Thibault. The inquiry into the death of an Iraqi civilian who died while in British custody has found that he was a victim of unjustified and brutal violence. Baha Musa died with 93 injuries in British Army custody in Basra back in 2003. The chairman of the inquiry, Sir William Gage, condemned corporate failure at the Ministry of Defence of the use of banned interrogation methods in Iraq. The MOD says it will consider carefully any recommendations from the inquiry. Lawrence Lee reports from London.
Baha Musa died at the hands of British soldiers who were supposed to be making Iraq a better place. Instead, this innocent 26-year-old was subjected to abuse described by this inquiry as violent and cowardly, a grave and shameful episode for Britain.
The events of 14 to 16 September 2003 were indeed a very great stain on the reputation of the army, and no doubt they did, at the time, greatly damage some of the good work done by 1QLR and other units in Iraq.
Here's the crux of it. The soldier being filmed, called a violent bully, was the only one to be jailed, even though many more are implicated. The techniques, as they're called, like hooding, are illegal under the Geneva Convention. Yet Baha Musa and 9 others were subjected to 2 days of this. The military unit was operating in a building without doors, in the open. Soldiers boasted about what they were doing. It was described as a free-for-all. Even before Baha Musa died, the detainees were described as looking like they'd been in a car crash. The soldiers were using the so-called 5 techniques: hooding, sleep deprivation, use of noise, wall standing, and food deprivation. All had been banned by the British government in 1972, yet somehow the soldiers knew all about them. The report points out that in 1971, the Ministry of Defence in this country accepted that the 5 techniques had been used by the British Army in Malaya, Kenya, Cyprus, British Cameroon, Swaziland, Brunei, Aden, British Guyana, Borneo, Malaysia, and Northern Ireland. By 2003, under Iraq, those techniques, especially hooding, were supposed to have been outlawed, but it's clear they were still being used.
There is no place in our armed forces for the mistreatment of detainees, and there is no place for a perverted sense of loyalty that turns a blind eye to wrongdoing or erects a wall of silence to cover it up.
The report calls for better training and says soldiers may not have been clear what was allowed. Lawyers for the Iraqi detainees say that's absurd.
We've seen the training materials. They've managed to lose the training materials from before the war, but we've seen the training materials from 2005 and 2008. And they're riddled, those materials are riddled with techniques which were clearly unlawful. Harshing, get them naked and keep them naked if they won't cooperate.
This was the biggest inquiry into professional standards in the British Army since the Bloody Sunday investigation into the killings of unarmed Catholics in Northern Ireland 40 years ago. It tries simultaneously to say that mistreatment of Iraqis wasn't a one-off, but that there was no general culture of abuse. Based on the evidence, some are likely to read it as the continuation of a historical pattern. Lawrence Lee, Al Jazeera, in London.
Well, joining us for today's show are our guests, all in London. Richard Kemp, he's a former commander in the British Army. Saba Al Mukhtar, he's a lawyer and president of the Arab Lawyers Association in the UK. and Kevin Law, UK legal advisor at Redress, a human rights organisation that seeks justice for victims of torture. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Thank you all for being here. Before we get into the thick of things, I'd like to get your thoughts first on this inquiry. If I can start with you, Saba Al Mokhtar, are you pleased with the outcome of this inquiry? Do you think the findings get to the bottom of the precise circumstances that led to Musa's death?
Not at all, because after 13 million, more than 13 million pounds from taxpayers' money, we have not learned anything new. Until now, the judge says he can't find out who did that. This man died in the custody of a camp which had commanders, which had a lot of people. This is not a Scouts boy camp where you don't know who's done what. This person has died out of torture. I think this needs a more investigation, and I think there should be a fuller public inquiry rather than a limited one as this one.
All right, Kevin Law, do you agree with that? As Saba said, this was the biggest investigation into the professional standards of the British Army since the Bloody Sunday inquiry in the early 1970s. It was £13 million. Was it thorough enough, in your opinion?
Well, I don't think many people have had a chance to fully absorb the report. It runs to 1,400 pages, and it only became public about 3 hours ago. So from Redress's point of view, we've had a chance to try and look at the summary and to keep track of what comments have been made so far. What I would say is that it appears to be a very thorough inquiry, and it's a very important step in the right direction, but it's not by any means the end of the matter.
But some critics have suggested that this is just a PR stunt. What do you say to that?
I would not use that description. As I said, I think it's a very thorough but rather narrow inquiry. The mandate which Sir William Gage was given was very specific. It was to look at what happened in this particular place at this particular time. So, you know, we can discuss what actually happened to the victims, including the tragedy of Baya Musa's death. But there are wider issues which we also need to look at.
Indeed. Well, let's just remind you now of how this case about the conduct of British soldiers in Iraq has become a major public inquiry that took 2 years to complete. It all started on the 14th of September 2003 when Baha Musa and 9 other Iraqis were arrested at a hotel in Basra by members of the 1st Battalion, the Queen's Lancashire Regiment. 2 days later, Musa died in British Army custody with multiple injuries. Then, in April of 2007, at the end of the most expensive court-martial in British history, Corporal Donald Payne was jailed for a year and dismissed from the army over the case. Almost 1 year later, the Ministry of Defence, the MOD, admitted breaching the human rights of Musa and others. And soon after, the Defence Secretary announced a public inquiry into Musa's death. In July of the same year, the Ministry of Defence agreed to pay $4.5 million compensation to mistreated detainees of this case. And a year later, the public inquiry began in London. And finally, on Thursday, the 8th of September 2011, inquiry head Sir William Gage presented his report. Now, Richard Kemp, some serious criticism levelled against the British Army in this report. Is this warranted, and how damaging has this case been for the British Army?
This criticism of the British Army is quite clearly warranted in this particular case. There can be no excuse, and I'm afraid I don't find plausible the excuses I've heard from some about actions in the heat of battle. There can be no excuse for treating a prisoner in this way. In my experience of service in the British Army, a commander has as much responsibility for the well-being and safety of his prisoners as he does for his own men. So it is unacceptable, and it is a huge criticism. But what I would say is that this is not typical of the behaviour of British soldiers. There are other armies where abuses are much more widespread, not so in the British Army. There have, of course, been other cases, and there will in the future, because it's the nature of warfare and it's the nature of human beings. But the British Army, I think, takes great pride in investigating incidents like this and then trying to deal with them as effectively as possible.
Well, the battalion's former commander, Colonel Mendoka, I believe, said that he did not know that the prisoners were being beaten up by his men in a detention center within the battalion base, and the chairman of the inquiry accepted this. But given your experience, is this likely? A large number of soldiers are said to have assaulted Musa and other Iraqi prisoners in detention, and some reports even suggest that the soldiers were basically gloating and boasting about all this. So is it likely that the commander didn't know what was going on?
I wasn't there at the time, and I can't tell you precisely what happened.
Your experience,
but what I would say is that,
given your experience, I mean, do things like this go on without the commander knowing?
Well, they certainly wouldn't if I was the commander. I've had responsibility for prisoners of war myself on many occasions in many different areas, and I have always ensured, and I think this is true of pretty much every British military commander, obviously with some exceptions, I've always ensured that there are sufficient measures and procedures and controls in place to ensure that not just those people who are dealing with a prisoner, but others above them and outside the immediate confines of the detention centre carry out checks and measures and balances, and that includes things like checks by medical officers.
Sure, but
now that clearly did not happen.
Right. I'm just going to interrupt you for a second. The inquiry also found that many other officers, including several officers, must have known what was happening. So does this suggest perhaps that there's a culture of not reporting abuse within the British Army?
Well, I don't think that's the case, and certainly isn't in my experience. And I've been involved with a very large number of British units, and I've not seen it. But I think in this case, clearly there has been a breakdown and a failure in command within this unit at this time. The Queen's Lancashire Regiment, which was the battalion concerned, is a very fine fighting unit which has an excellent fighting record in the British Army, and it has some extremely good soldiers within it. But clearly at this point in time, there was a failure for whatever reason. If those people who were more senior than those who were carrying out the abuse knew about it and didn't intervene, they failed in their duty of command. If their peers saw it and knew it was happening and didn't stop it happening, again, they were negligent, they were morally bankrupt, and they were wrong not to do so. And furthermore, I would say that I don't accept the line that there was a confusion about what was and what was not allowed as interrogation techniques. Every British soldier knows you may not beat up to any point, but particularly to the point of death, a prisoner that you capture.
Right, well, and I want to get to that point just in just a few minutes, because we do want to talk about the techniques used for interrogating Mr. Musa and other people there, techniques which were banned at the time. But if I could get to you, Kevin Law, this inquiry criticized individual soldiers within the army for unlawful methods they used, but it didn't suggest that there was systemic abuse of civilians, of prisoners by the British Army. Do you think this was really the case? Do you think it was a case of just a few bad apples, or is the abuse more widespread?
I think the way to understand that issue is to remember that the purpose of this inquiry, as I said earlier, was to look at a specific unit, a specific regiment over a specific period of a few days relating to certain specific detainees. So it's not surprising that the report does not find there was any systematic abuse. The important point, though, is then, well, could there have been, and is there perhaps a need for a proper public inquiry which will see whether or not, to actually ask that question, whether or not there was systematic abuse. And from our point of view, we think there is a very clear need for such a much more wide inquiry. And the reasons for that are several. Firstly, the chairman, William Gage, found, and it's already been said, that there was corporate failure. Those are his words. Corporate failure on the part of the Ministry of Defence. He was speaking about the whole way the banning of the 5 techniques more than 30 years ago was somehow lost. He was talking about the failure of the training, not having a proper interrogation policy, etc., etc. Now, if that is correct, and it obviously is it not reasonable to think that there may well have been other examples where abuse took place?
Right.
And it's not simply a question of speculation, because we know there's another inquiry already pending called the El Swaidi inquiry, which relates to allegations which took place in May 2004. There's a court case pending at the moment where over 100 other Iraqi civilians have alleged abuse. So until there's a proper inquiry into all of that, we can't answer that question.
Sure. Certainly, the issue of systematic abuse by the British Army has been, being discussed by campaigners, human rights campaigners, for a while now. So that's definitely a question that needs to be answered. But if I could get to you, Saba Al-Mokhtar, as Richard and Kevin just said there just a second ago, there were quite a few restrictions to this inquiry. It has no powers, from what I understand, to accuse troops of the crime, but we can expect, can we expect these conclusions that were issued today to be used by prosecutors, perhaps, as a basis for bringing further charges? And should there be further charges leveled against these soldiers who were implicated in this case?
Well, as a matter of fact, there are now at least 40 cases which are going into the court system for abuses of prisoners and detainees. There are other cases which are coming thereafter. There are hundreds of people who have been killed in detention. The problem is this: every institution, including the church and the state and the army, do sometimes make mistakes. We owe it to the British Army, which is an honourable army, which is a professional army, which is well known in the world, to actually say there was a mistake and we are going to remedy it, rather than trying to put the blame on some people by finding scapegoats and saying it is only these individuals. It's not possible to have an inquiry which spends that much of money and that long time just to go over the incidents on the events of 2 days. The British Army was in Iraq for a number of years. There were a lot of abuses. I think that is where the inquiry should be going, rather than on this particular fact. But even when one looks at the statements which were made by the chairman, he has been playing the role of the defense. He said that the soldiers were under stress and hot, and it was difficult, and their colleagues were being killed. These are all correct things, but when you send soldiers who are not trained enough, they are not equipped enough. This is just like a hospital brings in the fire brigade to treat patients, and if the patient dies, they say, sorry, it was the wrong people. I think we need an inquiry to find out if there is.
I'm just going to bring in Richard Kemp there. Richard, as Saba just said there, that there have been various excuses used as, to justify the treatment and the conduct of these soldiers. Are these excuses justifiable? I mean, are the reasons given, correct and justifiable in your opinion?
Well, I think there's a great deal of insight and circumstances that we need to understand about this, including the enormous pressures that these soldiers were under. And there were something like 10, 12 soldiers killed in Basra, British soldiers killed in Basra in the months preceding this tragic event. None of that,
so is that a mitigating circumstance?
No, not in my opinion it isn't. None of that excuses what happened. This is not even as if it's something that happened on the battlefield in the heat of battle. It happened in the heart of a British military base. Reasonable safety given what was going on around it, but it happened within the heart of a British military base, and it simply shouldn't have happened. No matter what was going on outside, no matter what pressures the soldiers were facing, the chain of command and the levels of supervision should have been adequate to make sure this didn't happen. I wouldn't accept any excuse for what happened here.
Well, let's talk about, you touched on this a little earlier, the interrogation techniques that were used, and there are several that were used on Mr. Musa and other detainees, methods that were banned by the British government back in 1972. They include, using sleep deprivation, for instance, hooding, wall standing, just to name a few. If these methods were banned back in 1972, why were they being used on Iraqi soldiers, rather not Iraqi soldiers, by British soldiers serving in Iraq, more than 30 years later? And how did they come to know about these methods if they were banned? Well,
I don't know the answer to that question, and I certainly don't think There was in the time I served in the British Army, and my service was all after 1972, none of those methods were acceptable techniques for interrogating or dealing with prisoners, and they should not have happened. But I think it goes beyond that. We're not just talking here about techniques that were banned. We're talking about physical brutality that no matter what soldiers were or weren't told, they should have known, and they would have known, that these things were wrong, that they're not allowed to treat prisoners like that. No humanitarian,
but how much do British soldiers know about, the Geneva Convention, for instance? How much do they know about what interrogation techniques to use and what not to use?
Well, they are trained in what they can and can't do. They're trained in what is and is not lawful in conflict. There's no question. They're trained in these areas from the very beginning of their training. I think what we've seen here is cases where clearly that training has not been hammered home, and I believe that the Army has put in place methods now to reinforce those training messages.
Do you think this technique of hooding, which was used on Mr. Musa, for instance, has it been completely outlawed now?
As far as I know, it has. And it was outlawed then. But people do things that they're not supposed to do. People do break the law in the army and in war in the same way as they do in any other environment. And it's the point that I was making earlier on is that those individuals have responsibility, but within a military organisation which faces so much stresses and strains, there are people above them in their chain of command, their commanders, who should ensure that they don't break the law, and when they do, or if they do, that they're dealt with immediately.
All right, Kevin Lowe, do you believe that soldiers should have guidelines in the first place to know what's legal and what's not legal?
I think the way to approach this is perhaps twofold, and I would agree with what Mr. Kemp has said. You don't need to have particular training to know that you cannot torture somebody to death. I mean, that's just so obvious that it goes without saying. And this inquiry, and it was already known years ago, has just confirmed that Mr. Bayamusa and others were brutally treated and totally unlawfully and illegally. The separate question is perhaps, well, were these people or should they have been interrogated or questioned? And yes, I don't think there's a problem with the idea that people suspected perhaps of wrongdoing should not be interrogated and questioned. The issue then becomes, well, what is permissible? Is it permissible to hood them for interrogation, to deprive them of sleep, to put them in these very painful stress positions, to subject them to noise and so on? These are the banned techniques, which unfortunately were not banned in practice.
Right.
And that is a very important part of this whole issue. So you know, just to sum it up, beating somebody up is obviously illegal, wrong, and there should be no need for any guidelines on that. But it should be certainly inculcated into all soldiers that it's against the law, it's a crime, and they will be dealt with if they do it. The question of how they should interrogate and how they should question people is then the broader issue.
Well, the inquiry chairman, William Gage, has made 73 recommendations for UK troops on how to treat prisoners, and they include asking detainees if they have any complaints about their treatment and suggesting Her Majesty's Inspector of Prisons visits battlefield holding centres. Another recommendation is each battle group should have a designated detention officer focused on coordination and management of prisoners and ensuring responsibility does not fall between the cracks. Another is a specific ministerial approval should be sought before the harsh approach is approved for use in theatre, and also a review every 3 years of tactical questioning and interrogation training must be undertaken. Saba Al-Mukhtar, what do you make of these recommendations? Are these enough in your opinion?
I think these are useful things, but I don't think they will change the picture, because there is a serious problem with the situation when you have a camp where detainees were being beaten up, tortured and killed, and nobody does anything. When, you know, there is nothing new about this hooding, as if we've just seen it. Everybody, including the media, has been showing the hooding of people since 2003. So does that mean that we need to spend £13 million at least to find out that it was illegal or it was wrong? I think there is fundamental mistake in the way that the whole exercise is being handled. I don't think it's a matter of, we don't want to go back to the original sin of invading another country, but we can look at the way that we have conducted ourselves. This is a professional army. There is a breakdown in the chain of command. There is lack of instructions within the army as how to do it. It's not possible for the inquiry to say that having gone for 2 years, spent so much money, he still cannot identify those people who participated in the torture of this man. This is not about an inquiry about a man being killed.
Sure.
We're looking at the institution, how it deals with this situation.
So we'll end on that pessimistic note. Thank you very much for speaking to us. All of our guests there in London, Richard Kemp, Saba Al-Mukhtar and Kevin Lowe. And thank you also for joining us on this edition of Inside Story here at Al Jazeera. As always, we welcome your comments and suggestions. You can email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks for watching.